look, I started as an inside sales representative, so picking up phones, calling, emailing people, and it's tough. Like 95% are people who reject you. You try and be polite, but it gives you a rhythm of how to talk to someone on the phone. Working through that becomes a really important skill set.
We're thrilled to welcome Tom Bentley, CRO at 10x Banking. He's helped FinTechs secure over £110 million in funding and helped them double their enterprise client base.
Can you talk about what is the part of FinTech you're in?
There's a thing called core banking. If you think about when you send money, when you open an account, when you take out a mortgage, your name, your product, your record of what that product is, it sits somewhere in the bank, and that sits on essentially a core banking system.
What does 10x Banking do?
The fundamental problem with banking, a lot of banks, working industry today, work on legacy technology that sits in cathedrals of code that don't allow for innovation at scale. We work to provide that core technology to power, next generation banking experience.
And the rapid kind of growth of AI changing the kind of core banking and banking as a service industries.
It's a really interesting one because
This is Matt from Work in FinTech, and joining us today is Tom Bentley, who's currently the CRO, that's the Chief Revenue Officer at 10x Banking, where he's spearheading global growth across Europe, APAC, the Middle East, and Africa. So Tom is a seasoned sales leader with years of experience in global fintech companies, starting off in Temenos through to Thought Machine and later at NatWest, and now at 10x Banking. So in this episode, we dive deep into Tom's journey from political science to fintech, unpacking how he built a high-performing sales career in one of the most competitive industries. We're also going to explore the sales playbook behind fintech enterprise deals, the biggest trends shaping the future of banking as a service, and how AI is revolutionizing financial operations and sales strategies. And towards the end, Tom will share what he looks for when he's hiring top talent, plus practical advice for students and young professionals who want to break into fintech. So let's begin. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Matt. Great to be here today on Halloween of all days. So, but yeah, it's great to connect with you. Thanks so much for the invite. Really excited about this.
Yeah, no, you're most welcome. So the idea behind this episode is to help students and young professionals learn from your experience and to understand how successful fintechs win big clients, and some of the how to build strong partnerships like you've been doing over the years, and also that how to adapt in that fast changing world of banking as a service. So we always like to kind of go back to the beginning. So can we go all the way back to, I suppose, when you were growing up? Where did you grow up? What type of student were you when you were back in school?
Sure. Winding back the clock, always a good thing to do. But so look, I was born in Cardiff in Wales. My Welsh accent usually only comes out after a pint. But I go home a lot. Most of, if not all, my family on my side is basically based there. And yeah, look, pretty standard childhood. My dad was a doctor. My mum was a nurse who then went and became entrepreneurial and became a florist. So it was quite an interesting background. And yeah, I had lots of different schools and so forth. But I guess the thing that was quite exciting is I went to a place called Atlantic College, where I won my spot there. And that's quite a famous school now, which if you Google it, it's part of a global community of schools called United World Colleges that sort of foster kind of international collaboration. So I did actually international baccalaureate. I didn't actually do A-level, which is quite different when I was applying for universities and so forth. But as a student, I was pretty due diligent. I kind of got the memo really early that, you needed to work hard. And, it's quite funny because I was really good at English and drama and, sort of, being the front and center of sort of the classroom. Ironically, even though I work in finance, I was terrible at maths, terrible at sciences and so forth, and the things that you kind of traditionally see sort of engineers and economists go into. But, always had a passion for people, always had a passion for learning. And yeah, that led me to kind of university where I studied politics.
And why choose politics? Did you want to become a politician?
Yes, actually. So what's interesting, Matt, because basically I had a kind of sense of purpose from early on, and I like the idea of being able to change systems and sort of get involved in more of the civil service side. And my heart, and still very much is, was kind of based in Wales. And the, Cardiff U2 is a great, red brick university, part of the Russell Group, and Plug Science was a great degree to go for. And it was actually sort of semi-connected to the CENF and kind of all the kind of devolution activity that was going on at the time. But about 2 years in, I sort of had the realization that, politics is a very long game, especially if you're not working in a political party as such. It's about sort of preparing the next generations of government, whether they're the same government, looking at sort of infrastructure. And I think a lot of it was very detailed kind of back-end work, which was really, really vital and still obviously is, but I felt it wasn't really me. At the same time, I really got into DJing, and my DJing career, I was very fortunately took off. So to sort of pay my way through uni, I would run club nights. I'd put on bands like Friendly Fires, to name one, Rusco, for those of you who are drum and bass and dubstep heads on this podcast. And I was really lucky that as part of that journey, I got to play Creamfields, Glastonbury. I got to play with Calvin Harris, Stanton Warriors, Dizzy Rascal, Too Many DJs. And that really gave me a kind of flavor for obviously not only music, but also kind of running a business, learning to do tax at the age of 19, which many people don't come into. So that gave me a flavor, I guess, of selling myself almost, but also kind of widened my scope that, there was more to kind of just finding a degree, following one path.
What was your DJ name?
It was Tommy B, Matt. It was Tommy B. So not very original. But it was really cool. I mean, anyone looking at, careers while they're for university, you can go work in shops. It's very valid. You can go work behind bars and things. DJ is pretty cool, right? Because if you're good at it, you get, good hourly wages. You get to control the dance floor. The only challenge of it is it's, very late night sometimes. So balancing that with studying was difficult. But somehow I managed it with a great group of friends and support around me.
Brilliant. So how did you go from DJing to FinTech?
Yeah, it's a great story. So basically finished university. I stuck around for a while. I had a girlfriend at the time, and unfortunately we broke up. And I kind of felt I needed to use my degree and do something different and sort of get out of Cardiff, right? I'd lived there all my life, and I moved to London. And I basically would DJ and kind of do my side hustle. And then in the week, I'd go and kind of apply for every graduate job going. And I was fortunate that I had some friends who'd sort of working in recruitment and already across London. And I came across a company called Pareto Law. And Pareto at the time was hiring top sales talent into top companies, into grad schemes. And the basis was you have to have a 2-1 or a first to kind of get on the program. And then you were sort of on your own fighting for your life in terms of being one of the ones they'd selected. So they'd run these kind of incredible selection days where you'd turn up in a room, there'd be 100 people. I don't think you see as much of this anymore these days, but there'd be 100 of you in a room, and over the space of a day, they would whittle you down to sort of 10. And all of the challenges and kind of interview techniques weren't about technical capability. So at the time, it was a company called Temenos, who I'd never heard of. But they were called banking company who had a little bit of a generational issue in that most of their sales teams and staff were, 50 plus, 45 plus. They wanted to bring some young, dynamic culture into the business, and they used Pareto to do that. But what was really interesting is there was no questions on technology, no questions on finance or mathematics. Everything was about raw personality and sales experience. And, to give you an example of one of the challenges, you got put in a boat with 5 other random people. You had been asked before when you did your introduction to pick a celebrity, and you basically had to debate and argue why your celebrity deserved a kind of place in the boat. So there were 2 or 3, I can't remember the exact number, but 2 or 3 spaces where, 3 of you wouldn't be in the boat. And some people, gave themselves up, tried to be, I'm being a good person, I'm happily step out. Others were hyper aggressive, did everything to annoy the rest of the people in the group. But basically, it was really simple. If you're on the boat, you move to the next stage. If you weren't on the boat, they took everyone out of the room, shook their hand, thanked them, moved them on. So it was a really interesting process. But out of that, basically, I got a spot. And just, in the context of this podcast, what was really interesting is they obviously, it was great. I had a first from university. where they could see that I'd done well academically. But what was really interesting for them was my DJ experience. Everyone around me had economic degrees. They had engineering degrees. They had some connection into finance. I had zero, but they were fascinated by the fact that I had basically, won awards, essentially paid most of my student debt off, DJing, got to quite a, really good position. They felt that entrepreneurial skill set was the right skill set to bring in and almost take a punt on compared to the other people within my group, which was, very lucky at the time.
That's super interesting, but that's what any young people need on their CV, is something to differentiate themselves, and it's a talking point. And for you, it gave you, I suppose, your first step into fintech.
Completely, yeah. I mean, I never imagined it at the time. At the time, it's just something I loved and enjoyed. But it shows you how, I think, for a commercial career in fintech, and I will talk a little bit all the skill sets I've gone on to learn as being part of that world. But it really helped me get a foot through the door. And I really was focused more on the commercial sales part than I was the fintech part. But it was naturally just very good timing that it was on the cusp of neo licenses coming in. You didn't have Monzos and Starlings around yet. They were only in their sort of infancy. So riding that wave was awesome. And sometimes it's a bit of luck. Sometimes it's a bit of magic, It's the same way I look at younger people I talked to today about AI and some of the new technologies. Everyone wants to work at an AI company, but have they followed the curve? Are they following a trend? What's the thing that's, differentiating those companies? These are the things that, everyone needs to consider when they're making those first choices.
So when you started your career in sales, how did you, I suppose, embark upon that? Because there's lots of sales playbooks and methodologies and processes and so on, and there's a lot to do with mentors and learning kind of on the job and from other people. How did you go about that?
So it was really interesting, Matt. So hard work. I started as an inside sales representative, so picking up phones, calling, emailing people. And it's tough, like 95% are people who reject you. You try and be polite. We've all turned down sales calls. We all know what that experience looks like, but it gives you a rhythm of learning the art of how to talk to someone on the phone, and especially in a C-level audience. And, in finance and fintech, decisions are made at certain levels, but getting through gatekeepers and working through that becomes a really important skill set. So that was a really good foundation to learn. On the mentorship side, I was really fortunate that I had 2 or 3 people who, to this day, I think of very fondly. There was a gentleman called David King, who was one of the best salespeople in the company at the time. Liked a good time, was very, very social, maybe a bit too social at some points. Unfortunately, he passed away. He's not with us anymore, but he would take me to meetings, give me exposure to a higher level of how he, spoke to C-suite, what was important in terms of cadence and making sure that you came across as credible, all the way to some very close friends of mine now, as an example, the managing director at the time, who then went on to run a very large business called Guidewire. He would, give me the right advice, give me the right feedback. And I tell, one trend I notice with strong people who kind of move up the career ladder quicker, they're really open to feedback and they don't take it negatively. They don't fight against it. They're easy to work with because they consume it and they can take from the feedback what is going to make them better. And the bits they disagree with, they don't have to necessarily shout or scream about. They take them on board and they kind of prove that worth. And the thing about sales in finance, it's a meritocracy. You have a number, you either achieve that number or you don't achieve that number. So it's very binary whether you like it or not, or however you manage. So going through that, I was very fortunate that I was, top performer in the year, and that led me to moving very quickly into a real solid role where it was sink or swim. So, for me, that 10 months experience was invaluable. And being very open, I turned down the DJing. At the time, I was managing some very, very famous banks and large accounts, and I couldn't, go to bed at 3 a.m. and wake up at 6 to be in an office for 7. Something had to give, and I just fell in love with the art of working with clients, building my career. Like to this day, I've continued to be in this industry and completely love it and adore it.
So let's talk about the kind of subset of fintech that you operate in. There's like banking as a service, and you're at Temenos, then you went to Thought Machine and NatWest, now you're at 10x Banking. Can you talk about firstly what is the part of fintech you're in, and then talk about what you're doing now?
Sure. I guess there's two strands to why I've been involved in. So my first love and overall love is a thing called core banking. And core banking is basically the heart and plumbing of a bank. In terms of my role at 10x, and we'll talk a little bit about, generationally what's happened in the industry or in my industry. But at the time I've come to Temenos, and they basically, if you think about when you send money, when you open an account, when you take out a mortgage, your name, your product, your record of what that product is in terms of debits and credits sits somewhere in the bank. And that sits on essentially a core banking system. And the reason that core banking is very complex, very difficult, is everything spins from that ledger. It's a central source of truth. If you think about your mobile phone, it's your kind of storage, right? Where all your contacts, all your messages, all your data is. That essentially is the core banking heart of a platform. And that really drives the heart and soul of a bank in terms of the products it can offer, the way it engages with customers, all of the digitalization that you've seen with the Revoluts and the Monzos and the Starlings come in the mix. And then obviously, of course, great banks like NatWest kind of digitalize and kind of make sure they can offer the same services. So it all comes down to where does the data sit? And that really is core banking. And then the second pillar of my career was a thing called embedded banking, or as you said, banking as a service. And essentially, banking as a service is the ability for banks to support non-financial brands. So to give you a really good example, when you get in and out of an Uber, you're not, handing over a card. There's no awkward kind of finding a payment card and flipping it over to the taxi driver. Everything happens seamlessly in the app. And that's because banking infrastructure is embedded within that app. As a case point, working with brands such as the AA during my time in NatWest, they were looking at offering their own set of financial products, which essentially are labeled as AA financial services. But behind the hood, NatWest is providing the license, the infrastructure. So it's a really interesting time for banks because what they're recognizing is banking isn't just happening in the branches, on the app, within their own ecosystem. It's happening in your Amazon checkout. It's happening when you split pay your washing machine or when you decide to finance a product. So the world of finance is moving very differently. And, to bring it back to this sort of working in fintech, it's interesting how you can start with the hypothesis of working in technology. My career has taken me all the way into different spaces where I've worked for big banks, learning how to read a balance sheet, how to talk to a senior level audience around things like repairments or credit risk engines or things that are quite complex in the context of banking. And to be really clear, I never had a degree on this. It came from the 10,000 hours principles of spending time working with lots of different banks, understanding their challenges, and then getting under the hood to really work in a bank and understand how a bank works from a tier 1 to a tier 4 level. So to your listeners, it's really interesting because 20 years ago, you were sort of stuck by either the degree you had or the technology set you understood. Now there's a whole world of companies and information that you can go into. The key thing that I advise everyone is become an expert in the thing that you really enjoy or love, because ultimately that will carry you through for your first decade. Where I see people go wrong sometimes is they sort of flick to different brands, different parts of the financial ecosystem, all under the banner of finance, which is brilliant. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing because you learn kind of the wider ecosystem. But to really move ahead in your career quickly and to get that head start that people are looking for, having that specialism becomes really, really, really important.
So what do you do now at 10x Banking? You're Chief Revenue Officer. So what does that encapsulate, and what does 10x Banking do?
Sure. So 10x's mission is basically to make banking 10 times better for everyone, and that was the heart and soul of our founder, Matthew Jenkins, who essentially was the group CEO at Barclays for a number of years. So he essentially recognized the fundamental problem with banking. In order for that mission to be true, you need to have the right technology stables. A lot of banks working in industry today work on legacy technology that sits in what I call cathedrals of code that don't allow for innovation at scale, or they're very costly. So the ability to pass on that cost saving to their customers is very, very difficult. So we work to provide that core technology that I mentioned before to power, next generation banking experience for very, traditional brands such as JP Morgan, who launched Chase UK here in the UK, all the way to Old Mutual, which, if you look at the press this week, are, really winning customers with a new proposition that's really digitalized and really, really interesting, all the way to working with much smaller banks who are ultimately looking just to migrate their cores and look at the next generation of customers. So as an example, we're working with West Brom Building Society here in the UK. You've got a fantastic project to enable much better, consumer experiences for their customers, all the way to, for example, a client out in Australia called Constantinople, who were trying to help the mutual industry within that space move on to a common platform. You think about sort of open banking, all the digitalization that's coming in, even to the point around stablecoin and some of the more crypto-based entities. In the end, from a banking perspective, it's regulated, it's highly, highly, highly sort of safeguarded in the context of being secure. The key thing around that is data. So it's the security of the data, but also the ability to have that real-time data so that when, Matt, you ask your AI engine to, tell you what your current balance is and what budget you might be able to forecast for the month, what sort of loan product could you take out because you might be getting married next week, just giving examples here. You need to have real-time data, not only just the functional number, but also the behaviors, the transactions, all the levels of details that come with that. So for us, at 10x, my role essentially is to help banks modernize, give them the security that we're able to do that. But ultimately, the fantastic bit about my job is working with a team across the world in Singapore, Australia, Africa, the UK, to name a few countries, where every kind of piece of innovation is different. And that's really the mission of 10x, is to create the common, but ultimately have the ability to really understand the uniqueness of each customer and the way they want to serve their member base.
What's kind of like the roadmap and vision going forwards then? Because you moved from a big well-known household name, NatWest, and moved over to 10x, which obviously Anthony Jenkins is a big figure in the city, very well known. So what kind of attracted you to move, and where do you see things going from here?
Sure. I mean, to be clear, NatWest was just the most amazing experience. I mean, and we didn't talk about it, but building a new company within NatWest to look at a new sector was fascinating. And that team's doing incredibly well. My main motivation for moving is I look at my career a little bit like a toolbox. So, everyone's toolbox is different, but there's common tools, right? So as a salesperson, everyone's done, you strive to do a deal over £1 million, then it becomes 10 million, then it becomes 50 million, then it becomes 100 million. And the kind of weird kind of screws or components within the box, for example, getting experience of learning how a banking license operates. I was really, working within a bank, a complex tier one bank, that's not something that everyone has. And I felt after my time at NatWest, I got a really good sense of that. The bits I was missing is, working with a mentor such as Anthony Jenkins has been an incredible experience. So having those mentors in the business become really, really important. And, as a 38-year-old who's very fortunate, to have got this position and had a number of C-level roles now, for me, the next move is really around dialing into getting that global experience and building brand renaissance, taking people to the next step, whether that's moving the dial from a company that's doing X amount of revenue to triple figures or being able to double a consumer base. It's those landmark moments that really define you in your career. And I'm very, very fortunate that I've worked with some incredible people. So the ability to help shape teams, help shape missions, for me, that was really, really fascinating. I'm hugely committed to the 10x mission because I think it's got incredible technology. And, this year, as an example, we've almost doubled the clients, working on the platform. We've got a number of really exciting announcements coming out, which I'm really proud to be part of over the next few months. But again, in that wider career lens, coming back to the toolbox, it's the completing the toolbox, for those of you who play Nintendo Switch, it's about getting to the next, Mario level, right? But in order to do that, you've got to work out how you get those right combinations so that when the time comes and those opportunities arise, you've got all of the relevant experience and material to be ready for that move. Because again, Matt, being at a C level, I don't just think about myself. I think about my teams, my employees. I think about their families. You're safeguarding a mission, right? And this is something that I learned from Temenos, ironically, that people are very key in the kind of wider view of how businesses run.
Yeah, fascinating. How do you see technology and the rapid kind of growth of AI changing the kind of core banking and banking as a service industries?
It's a really interesting one because we did a survey recently, and 1 in 3 of the banks we serviced have integrated some form of AI into their core solution, but it's at I would say, very much an internal level. If you look at things like Copilot and other tool sets, it's about supplementing internal work today. It's not reinventing the customer experience. And I think for those of you who use AI a lot, it's not something we fully for us to do A to B in terms of jobs and priorities. So I think banking is one of the, if not the most safeguarded industries, because ultimately our money is what drives our families, our ambitions, our goals. Unfortunately, however we feel about capitalism, it is the thing that motivates our lives, right? Whether it's buying a house or getting married or retiring or moving to the other side of the world. So ensuring that safeguarding is there is really key. But to talk a little bit about the way we look at AI, AI is really exciting for us in the context of migration. So moving legacy systems onto our platform. If we're able to cross-check data sets before migration occurs, that saves a lot of time and energy, which is really important tasks, but have traditionally been done with Excels and people going line by line by line. Very intensive work. At the same time, innovation around building product kind of components that are really interesting. I remember about 10 years ago, you had a lot of noise around personal finance management. Matt has spent £200 on Starbucks this month. Naughty Matt. You sort of don't want to know these things, right? They're not an enjoyable experience. Will it turn you off your bank? So the fine tuning of some of these toolings is going to become really, really important. But certainly, AI is here to stay. I think for anyone looking at a modern career in FinTech, I think you want to look at businesses who enable that future ecosystem. They don't necessarily have to be AI companies, but they certainly have to have the right methodologies and architecture to support where that new economy is going to come from.
Do you use any AI tools yourself, or does your sales team use AI tools?
We do. So we use it a lot for data and data mining of certain principles. So, for example, if I am preparing for a meeting, and let's take this meeting as an example, I might ask ChatGPT to tell me all about Matt, the work in fintech, the principles, to be well prepared for that conversation. And at the level that we operate, you get a C level, maybe even only 10 minutes. You want to land very concise messages very, very quickly. That's when it becomes extremely useful. So on a personal level, I love using it for music. So I like following bands and people I love and the music that they love. And that's led me to a whole wormhole of new music. I mean, I don't know how much you like music, Matt, but I remember the days where I'd go to HMV and I'd get a budget to buy free CDs, usually dance CDs. I'm getting to buy the new Cassius album or something new from Fatboy Slim, and all my money would go. Now I can literally access every single song that Fatboy Slim's ever done in the last 20 years of his career. It's incredible, right? We're at a push of a button. But you can get fatigue from AI. You have too much music, too much information. You don't take the time to appreciate it. So getting that balance right from a personal and professional level is really, really important, I feel. How do you think? Do you use it as well?
Yeah. I use AI in everything I do at the moment. In sales meetings, I actually have 3 bots that join every meeting that I have.
Wow.
And they're all transcribing and give me insights in slightly different ways. Similar, doing prep for meetings is very, very useful and quick. but I think across the business in iPushPull, the other company that I look after, as probably like you've seen, developers can leverage AI so they can work a lot quicker, work a lot faster. There's certain things they can use for testing, which means that you can that frees up more time so they can focus on kind of core coding. But yeah, no, I think it's great. In terms of music, I mean, I've actually can't quite see that. I've got some records behind me and my 1210s. So I was a Bentley DJ back in the day, but
oh, okay, cool. We're kindred spirits. We're kindred spirits on that front, which is good.
No, exactly. Maybe
a good point that
DJ back in the past.
Maybe I don't think so, but one thing to mention that as well, just I think it's important in the context of the podcast is I find obviously I've sat in meetings where there's Otter and all sorts of tools going off, kind of catching everyone's insights and inputs into the meetings. What's also interesting, I think, in terms of the audience for this podcast, is engagement is also being captured. And I think what surprised me is I was recently on a call with a bank, and after the call, that I got sent an engagement score of how engaged I was in the conversation. And I do feel more recruitment firms, more graduate schemes, they'll start to use this tooling. As an example, early on in my career, I went for an interview process where they used AI to evaluate who I am as a person. And I thought the evaluation was completely incorrect when I actually looked at it. So I think being able to understand in that setting is going to change the way in which people kind of get on the ladder or the way they are evaluated, I think it's really, really key. And I think being ahead of that, even whether you like it or not, is really important, because understanding, for example, tone of voice, how AI feels about the way you convey a message or to be concise, these things, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, are going to be used. And either embrace it, or you understand early on how companies embrace it so that you're prepared for it, or you actively hunt out companies who do not use it or more have more of that personal touch, coming back to the way that I was hired and the process that I went through in terms of the way that they took a gauge on people, I think is key.
No, definitely. I know the founder of a company called Ribbon AI, and that is they pivoted into what they're doing now to be very successful, where they are using AI to do interviews. So for a first round interview, you're actually talking to an AI. So very much like you said, wow. you need to understand how to change the pitch and intonation and move around and gesticulating and so on. So you look like you're engaged. On the flip side of that, back in kind of in real life, that goes back to where building out a network, meeting people, getting yourself out there, pressing the flesh, becomes even more important as well. So I think if you're a young person trying to get yourself a job and get out there, you need to be start to master both, where you're understanding how to use AI tools to optimize how you put yourself across, as well as how you do that in person as well. And those soft skills, I think, going back to what you said at the very beginning about when you're a DJ and actually you use your DJing when you were going to London every month DJing to then go and visit firms and apply for positions and interviews and so on. But no doubt the soft skills you picked up when you were DJing gave you the confidence to, when you got in a room, the DJ bit was interesting, but obviously it's your charisma and your confidence that people really liked as well, and which they saw potential in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was really fortunate, as I said, to have some incredible mentors. But, for me, the advice I always give younger people is have a 5-minute pitch, a 10-minute pitch, and a 15-minute pitch on how you talk about yourself. The 5-minute is all about being concise and factual and kind of nailing, to your point, the things that you've achieved, like that everyone's kind of baseline against. But what are the angles that, to your point around the great work that you guys do around these, bringing people together for a day, giving them something unique to talk about when they come into those kind of processes from whatever background they may be. The 10 minutes is about sort of fleshing out the ideas around what makes you tick beyond the factual, beyond the reference point. And then the 15 is really you start to show that personality and what rounds you as an individual. And if you can nail the 5, 10, 15, it's amazing how many people I meet who either sit really well on the 5 minute but can't fill the 15. As a salespeople, you need to be able to fill the 30 or the hour. or people who can't, they can't get very concise, they waffle, they're not very, you know, deliberate in terms of their mission, and they run out of time. So the 5, 10, 15 for me becomes almost like a mantra that every, grad 18 to 21 should be looking at.
So two questions before we finish up. One is, you said earlier about if you're in your career and starting out your career, you should be looking at companies that are enabling a future ecosystem, and that's a kind of a good place to be aiming for. Is there any particular ecosystems you see that are kind of nascent at the moment, which look very exciting? And if you weren't kind of in the area you're in, you'd be like, yeah, that would be something that, I would advise my son or daughter to start looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two, right? So I think AI as a general term is a bit of a misleader, right? Because there's so many different variations of AI. If you're looking at fintech/finance, I think that engagement of being able for in banks to understand how they adopt AI in a safe and compliant way becomes interesting. I won't name companies, but those companies that are nailing not just the kind of algorithms or the kind of models, but are looking at the distribution model, the partners they're working with. I always look at ecosystems as a validation. Have they been on, for an example, a top 4 innovator program, right? That's a really good reference point to know they're serious and they're probably credible. And obviously, alongside that, you need to like the teams, you need to like the founders, you need to like their mission. On the flip side of that, I think it's an interesting one, but I think the availability to service new engineering principles, so the availability to sell new technology sets where, for example, banks globally won't have access to AI engineering capability. They won't have access to expertise. So beyond just the technology side, looking at the servicing side becomes really interesting from ecosystem play. I've deliberately not mentioned stablecoins. I think everyone's kind of talking about that, and look, we've seen all sorts of variations of that, and we don't know where that's going to land. But certainly, I'd say looking at, and I think you could apply it to most industries, looking at where the new products, the new product sets are emerging in market. So, for example, a lot of the banks we work with want to offer differentiated product sets based on innovation that's being driven in the US, Australia, UK. As an example of that, being able to offer a stable coin or a crypto product to their client base. In the same way in embedded finance, being able to offer buy now, pay later or a split pay product to your client base becomes really, really key. So I would kind of look out for those material new products that are really interesting. Again, like at the time when I joined Temenos, it was not the new kid on the block. It was listed. It had some great kind of momentum, but there was such a huge market for it to go after. We had a real uplift in people wanting to transform onto new technology. Finding those curves and waves, that's half the fun of it.
And final question, if you were to go back in time and speak to your 18-year-old self in Cardiff, what would you say?
Worry less. I'm a massive worrier. I worry about my children. I worry about the state of the world and all these sort of things. That's naturally me. But at 18, I was just worried about, it was a financial crisis. There were things going on in the world where no one knew what's going to happen. And actually, it was the best thing I ever did because I got to join somewhere where you saw the hardest part of the business and you got to watch it grow. And that's where character is and metal is made, right, Matt? Unfortunately, life's not always rosy. It's the roller coaster that's good fun. So to my 18 myself, I'd say worry less, pull down the handlebar, enjoy the ups and the lows, because ultimately that's where the satisfaction lies, and that's half the fun of us being here, right? Bit of a deep way to end this, but enjoy the ride.
Yeah, it's about the journey.
And I always talk to my parents about this, but they grew up in some really difficult times. We once in this country we had interest rates at 15%. We once had some really difficult moments, but again, if you have focus, you have mission, and you look for those people who are going to support you, and you North Star to work to the best of your ability. I'm very fortunate that I've had some great mentors and some great lucky breaks. These things come, but they don't come unless you've got the ability to drive and work at it. But I wish all your listeners well, and I hope out of this conversation they've taken away that you can be a DJ and still end up working, in fintech or finance, right? There's always a path.
Thank you so much, Tom. How can people reach out to you or follow you? Where's the best place?
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm mostly active on LinkedIn, so Tom Bentley 1. Please follow 10x Banking. We've got really interesting stuff, and we love working with young people. We have a huge impact agenda driven by our co-founder Amanda Jenkins. That's really, really interesting. That really looks to kind of enable top talent. And very happy to speak to any of your listeners. We one of the key dimensions of 10x is not only our ability to change banking, but also the impact and legacy that we leave behind. So we think these things are really important. So thank you.
Amazing. Tom Bentley, thank you very much.
Thank you.